This is a new video with a slightly new angle, a little more history about what it was like to arrive here in what became known as Didsbury. Our agriculture room upstairs shows a great deal of what folks had to deal with. Emigrating from a technologically advanced 1890s society in the east to virgin land in the west left many settlers confused and afraid, yet somehow incredibly determined. How were they going to tame this unsettled wilderness they were being led to? The beauty is that the pioneers of the Alberta prairies and foothills came in such numbers and brought so much with them that it wasn't long before these virtual strangers became friends, neighbors, and a community. Sure, it took large amounts of courage to pack up all one's earthly belongings and travel over 2,000 miles to a veritable untamed wilderness just on the hope of a great future. But it also took foresight, strong will, perseverance, and faith in the future. Railway building had already been active even before the Calgary and Edmonton Railway was built in 1890. Eventually, the C&E railway line was completed, running between Calgary and Edmonton, helping create many railway towns along the line, including Didsbury. That main artery moved the settlers into the region, but it was also the lifeline to markets for grain. Here's a little trivia for you. Did you know that almost every American saddle horse in Western Canada, and a number in the East, either started from a Fulkerth stud or had some Fulkerth blood somewhere along the line? Didsbury's Joe Fulkerth pioneered the breed in Western Canada, and he was still breeding and training American saddlebred horses until his death at the age of 94 in November of 1928. His picture is at the entrance to our ag room, and it's a good idea to take a few moments to read the plaque alongside. When you first step into the largest exhibit room at the museum, our agriculture room, you will likely just stand there for a moment and drink in all the tools used by farmers and ranchers in the good old days. If you have been following our video series, you know that the first settlers in the Didsbury area were predominantly Mennonite brethren in Christ, led west by Jacob Y. Shaunce in 1894. Their first concern was to build a church, and the primary task of the settlers was to create farmsteads. Locating their homesteads was not always easy. Each quarter section was marked at its four corners by iron survey stakes, which often became hidden in the prairie grass. Using the circumference of the wheels of their wagons and counting each turn of the wheel, they measured off the distance to their own homestead grants. Without the help of a compass, often several attempts were required. Eager to get started, the homesteader would begin the back-breaking task of clearing the land and preparing it for seed which would provide his first crop. Most of the early farmers cut the bush and trees by hand with an axe. As you walk past the handmade wooden planes by the Sawatsky brothers, you will see a very well-worn axe. There is a barn full of tools here. In the early 1900s, levels were made of wood, not plastic. Harry Penner gifted a level that was made in Germany out of teak wood. This one was great for leveling logs and squaring the timbers. Settlers definitely wanted the window frames and hanging doors on their new cabins straight. Mr. Penner also donated a draw knife. It is used to shape wood by drawing the knife towards the user. A person must be extremely careful when using this type of knife. Some artists also use a similar draw knife for wood sculpting. More wood tools include a handmade wooden lathe for turning and shaping wooden spindles. There is also the beaver wood lathe that was used by Didsbury's school students in shop class. We have even got a Fairbanks balance scale donated by Florence Cossey, and Elsie Archer gifted the museum a classic Yankee push drill. These were once found in every shop and every job site's tool bag. Lots more tools on display, including several brace and bits, a cattle dehorner, hay saws for cutting bales of hay, and hip saws, a scythe, tap and die set, welding tank keel, a spark plug wrench, steel wedge, bearing scraper, a whole pile of S-wrenches, wire stretchers, hay forks, and a cotter key puller. All you must do is look in your father's garage, and you will see the value every man gives his tools, even nowadays. Dad's Makita and DeWalt tools are just a little different than the ones used on the farm 130 years ago. Now a staple craft item on Etsy or Pinterest, the cast iron metal tractor seat has had quite an evolution. If the manliness of our farming forefathers was measured by how much physical discomfort they suffered, they would have scored high points. Donator Cliff Ekstrand might have thought that walking behind a plow would have been better than sitting all day on a hard metal seat that transferred every jarring bump to the poor farmer's tailbone. Eventually, equipment was devised whereby a good team of oxen or horses could provide the power to pull stumps and plow the newly cleared land. We have got horse collars on display. They are part of the harness used to distribute the load around a horse's neck and shoulders when they pulled a wagon or plow. The collar allows the horse to use its full strength, and it also reduces pressure on the horse's windpipe. When they wore a collar, the importance of horses was in part because they could then apply 50% more power to a task than could an ox, due to the horse's greater speed and greater endurance. You will see lots of horse and oxen-related items in the agriculture room, including a bow yoke, which is a wooden crosspiece placed on the necks of oxen. Lord Chandler gifted a handmade double oxen yoke from the 1800s. The main beam of this yoke is made of poplar. The hex staves are of oak, laboriously steamed and bent into shape. 2 oxen could be hitched to pull a plow using this yoke. Frank Neufeld made a miniature replica of an old-time haystacker, and it's on display in this room, complete with a write-up on the entire procedure. There are photos of haying operations from the Bearberry area using teams of horses and antique cutters. One of our favorite artifacts is a walking plow that was brought from Roland, Manitoba by Alex McNaughton's family in 1901. This was used to turn and break up the soil, to bury crop residues, and to help control weeds. Kind of takes us back to Little House on the Prairie days. Your grandparents' grandparents would be the ones who could tell you some of the family tales of working the land that settled Didsbury. Didsburyans were sure happy when Ezra Sherrick arrived in 1896 and built a desperately needed sod blacksmith shop. He was kept busy sharpening plowshares, the main cutting blade for the sod breakers. Sinclair's blacksmithing and welding shop operated in town from about 1909, constructing shoes for all sizes of horses, until 1974 when it was demolished by a new owner. Value Drug Mart was erected on that site in 1975 and continues to operate from that location, now owned by Dion and Brad Blatz. The estate of Cliff Thaler gifted a blacksmith forge. A forge is an open furnace for heating metal ore and metal. You'll have to go to Days of Yore to see a working forge. Marvin Neufeld gifted a metal drill press, and there is a hand-cranked model with accessories from Bill Reinhardt that is pretty impressive as well. While the CPR coming to Calgary led the settlement of the West, the movement began slowly, and the flood of immigrants did not come until after the C&E Railroad had been built. Until the railway reached Didsbury and stores were opened, Calgary was the nearest point to buy supplies. That trip, by horse and wagon, was a 2-day journey each way. Thanks to the railway, the early years of Didsbury saw a great increase in the number of settlers, and consequently businesses sprang up. The first store in Didsbury was built in 1898 by J.C. Robertson and answered the settlers' fond hopes for a store with adequate stock. By the summer of 1901, there were 3 general stores, a hardware store, a harness and saddlery shop, several lumber yards, a livery stable, a hotel, a boarding house, and a blacksmith shop, all catering to the horse-powered farm community. While the town was expanding, the agricultural community was as well. It became easier to get your horse shoed, hardware from farm machinery repairs could be purchased without having to go to Calgary, and ladies could get fabric and baking ingredients from the local mercantile. The soil in the region was rich and black, and crops were enormous throughout. Farming was considered a proud way to make a living in this new land. And, of course, ranching became a vital occupation in the food chain. Cattle not only fed the early settlers in the region, but were shipped to the rest of the country and further, both beef and dairy cattle. Speaking of dairy, milk was a staple everyone liked to have on their tables. It was delivered to each home. Delivery was a one-man operation, and if you have ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, you will have a vision of what that was like. Milk was delivered with a sleigh and team in the winter, and horse and wagon after the snow was gone. In the Depression years, cream sold for 25 cents a pint, and you got 12 quarts of milk for $1. Milk was not refrigerated or pasteurized, but was cooled in water and ice and delivered fresh. And if you have seen the movie Frozen, you have an inkling of how a summer supply of ice was cut in blocks from the Rosebud or Little Red Deer River during the winter. Hard work, that's for sure. In 1921, to secure the Calgary milk trade, Didsbury producers formed the Didsbury and District Dairy Association. In our dairy exhibit, you can see bottles and caps and cream cans and cream separators that made their appearance in the early 1900s. The centrifuge on exhibit was used for measuring the butterfat content in milk. It's from the farm of Lawrence Chandler and was donated by his daughter Wilma Fisher. At the end of December in 1979, residents in Didsbury, Carstairs, and Crossfield had their milk delivery discontinued due to simple economics. The cost of fuel was up, as was labor and repair bills of refrigeration-equipped trucks, all of which forced George Wilkins to make this decision after 33 years. At that time, 3/4 of the milk was delivered to stores and the rest to homes. Back then, even bread was delivered to the front door. Using ice to preserve food and make ice cream, after the coolness of winter disappeared, was quite a process. The ice was preserved for summer use by packing it in sawdust in a log shed. In these early times there was not much money, but folks still needed their coffee. Some people even made imitation coffee by roasting barley. Farmers grew large gardens and exchanged vegetables at the store for groceries. In the fall, they took wheat to the Maple Leaf flour mill in Didsbury to trade for a year's supply of flour. Let's talk just a bit about the flour mill. Run by Manasseh Weber, his first mill could handle 75 barrels a day. His elevator had a capacity of 35,000 bushels. In 1910, his entire plant burned down. But with true prairie determination, Mr. Weber erected a new plant and was back in operation the next year. This was a great feat and a distinct advantage to the people of Didsbury because a flour mill secured a town's position as an agricultural service centre. In fact, the economic future of the province rested primarily on the performance of its agricultural sector. Farming was life to the early settlers. The entire family pitched in. They planted vegetables, raised animals for food, and grain was grown for cereals, flour, and feed. They picked wild berries, hunted, and fished. Geese were a welcome change in the food supply, and made good watchdogs as well. Wild fruit grew in abundance because there was little human traffic to tramp it down. Berries close by were gooseberries, black and red currants, raspberries, strawberries, chokecherries, and pincherries. Potatoes were a big staple of life for the settler families. Cliff Ekstrand gifted an early potato planter from about 1912. Take a moment and consider how long it would have taken to plant a crop of potatoes using one of these. But potatoes became an important cash crop. Right beside that is a corn planter donated by Bessie Ekstrand, also from around 1912. It would take a lot of muscle to plant a corn crop with these tools. Turkeys were also raised to supplement the food supply, friendly to raise and tasty to eat. Same with pigs, who ate most of the corn. Chickens were a valuable part of the food source, as they laid eggs for the table every day and could be slaughtered for their meat once their egg-laying days were over. We have a pretty cool egg grading station and an incubator. Before there were poultry shed heaters, incubators were usually kept in the back room of the house and fueled by kerosene at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They usually held between 50 and 300 eggs, and each egg had to be turned every day. Settlers also raised bees anywhere there was an abundance of plants to attract them. Fred Hambroff donated a beehive smoker used to calm honeybees, and our special bee farming exhibit with the honeycomb is a highlight for the children who tour the museum as part of the school curriculum. And of course, ranching became a vital occupation in the food chain. Cattle not only fed the early settlers in the region, but were shipped to the rest of the country and further. We have got a good display of beef cattle equipment, including a nose ring for leading a bull from Herman Doran's farm, and a calf mask, nothing to do with pandemics. There is an old-time gopher trap, looks old but did the trick and saved a lot of cattle ankles. There's a hot tattoo machine from Cal and Melvin Dick. As we moved through the recession of the 1920s, the depression of the 30s, to the boom of war and post-war development, we can still marvel at the optimism and fortitude of our forefathers. During the tough years, children went barefoot in summer, wore last year's clothing year after year, trudged through snow in rubbers, their feet bandaged in newspapers, or stayed home when the winter clothing was no match for Mother Nature. It was a time when bread was spread with butter or jam, but not both, when an inexpensive molasses cake was reserved for company, when people believed hard work would yield an abundant future, even though poverty became the norm. The Mountain View region stretches out across 1 million acres of rich farmland, with well-tilled fields enclosed with barbed wire fences. Those settlers who built anew might enjoy seeing the fulfillment of their dreams, a land well populated, where schools, churches, and towns are within the reach of all, where families of many nationalities and faiths can, for the most part, live side by side in harmony, still preserving the standards cherished by generations past. There are many more items on exhibit here at the museum, and we hope you will come in and wander our rooms and halls very soon.